Welcome to the Streets and People podcast presented by Get Around Cabo Car Free. Get Around Cabo Car Free is a volunteer community movement advocating for more transport options for people who can't drive in Caboolture and Morayfield in Queensland. In today's podcast, we'll be covering one of these three broad topics. It might be Road Rules 360, where we discuss Queensland's road rules, the legislation, the design for people walking, biking, in wheelchairs or on a scooter. It might be Not Everyone Drives, where we chat with people whose transport options don't include a car in a car-dependent society. And it might be People and Projects, where our conversations are with people working on a specific aspect of inclusive transportation. Today we're doing one of our People and Projects episodes. I'm here on Gubbi Gubbi country in Queensland, in Caboolture. We are really pleased to have Conrad Kickert with us. I know Conrad through an article I read in The Conversation. The Conversation is where academics have their formal research published and turned into lay articles. It's actually my prime news source. I don't really look at any other news source because it's the only one that I feel that is reliable, and I feel that people have a depth of understanding and context. It puts it in such simple, straightforward language. So that's why I like The Conversation. I reached out to Conrad because you had written an article about front yards. We have a big garden here in my home. People love it. They stop, they say hello because we have a really interesting garden. So I became very curious about this, and I had read it elsewhere. So I thought it would be great to have you on the show. So perhaps you could open with where are you calling from and maybe a little bit about your job, but mostly what made you interested in even studying this area?
Thank you very much, Wendy, for having me. I'm calling in from Buffalo, New York. I sometimes have to explain New York is a big state. We are on the other side of the state to New York City. We're close to the Canadian border, so close to Toronto, Canada. It's a very good question. How did I get interested in front yards? Buffalo, I would say, is a mid-sized American city. The metropolitan area is around 1 million, just under 1 million, I think. And a fairly green city. For American standards, a fairly walkable city as well. The house I live in is an older neighborhood. I walk around. So much of the walkable city is social contacts. I teach architecture at the local University of Buffalo. I teach about cities, and I have to ask students, well, why do cities exist? And people say, oh, I don't know, there's jobs in cities or it's more dense in cities. And, we have to kind of think, okay, one of the reasons cities exist is because for some reason we tend to be pack or herd animals. We like to be close to each other. And part of that is social contact. Why cities are there. A lot of this social contact, the more I walk around, I teach on the traditional city square or the plaza or the church or whatever convening place that you have. I notice so much of our contact actually takes place in what some people call the sort of everyday urbanism, in this everyday environment that is often in front of your own house. I'm originally Dutch, like Marco that you've had recently. The Dutch do the same thing. We don't have these front yards. The Dutch cities are kind of dense. Homes are usually right next to the sidewalk, very walkable places. People tend to socialize right in front of their homes. And I thought, this seems to be an aspect of cities that has been a little understudied. I do urban design research. I kind of tend to look at the physical environment of cities and what that does or how that changes. And I thought, I think I'm onto something here. So let's study this stuff. I have a much longer research agenda of how buildings relate to public space, which I personally think is so understudied and so important because it's so much part of life of the cities. It's not just happening on the streets, it's happening right next to the streets. So this was a natural segue for me to study. So I went about. I had a little army of students and we said, let's go study how these front yards in a specific neighborhood of Buffalo, what we would call a streetcar suburb. So a streetcar suburb being, fairly walkable place. I know Australia has a lot of those as well. How people act in their front yards, like what do they do in their front yards? And specifically, does it give them a greater so-called sense of place? Because that's the other really magical thing that cities are pretty good at, which is to offer people a sense of place. It is less fuzzy than it sounds. It's essentially that people feel attached to their neighborhood or to their environment, to their neighbors, to their street. Do they feel like their environment suits their needs? Do they feel that their environment has a strong identity? For instance, say historic neighborhood. Do they feel they connect to nature? All of these things are pretty important, because if people don't like the place that they live, they move around a lot. And again, you gotta remember the glue that holds these cities together, social connections. So people start moving around all over the place. It's generally not seen as a very good thing for cities. We went about, we said, all right, let's study what people do in these front yards. One early statistic that I was quite amazed about is 80% of new social connections in neighborhoods, you move in, are made in front of your house, which is kind of crazy, right? But when you think of it, you're like, I think that makes sense, right? I mean, where do you meet your neighbors? How do they know that you live where you live? Well, it's in front of your house. This little, some people call it like a hybrid zone, the zone between your house and the street. It's super important for that social glue in your neighborhood. It's not just the third place. It's not just the coffee house. It's not just the grocery store or the square or the street. Nope. It's exactly this weird hybrid zone. Is it public? If it's private, your front yard, or if you're Dutch, a couple of steps in front of your house. That's where a lot of the social life happens. We went out to study. We looked at 25 blocks. Within that block, it was almost 1,000 front yards. We said, what are we going to measure as to what people do in their front yards to connect to the city? We first had to take a step back saying, what do people do in their front yards to connect to the city? It's not always just making conversation, and it goes from passive to very active. First of all, people show their values. I am lucky that I just had to repaint my house. My value is I have a beautiful new sage green house, so I guess there's a sage green value to my house. Sometimes people put a little flag in front of their house, political flag or sports team. The garden gnomes, pink flamingos, those are all things that show your value. Very, very important, by the way, because it also gives you psychologically a sense of ownership over your environment, which is very important. You want to have your domestic environment feel like it's yours. You then socialize, where you can put seats in front of your house. The typical porch is that weird zone between the house and the street where people can sit and talk. Last but not least, you do mark your territory. Each person, and this is totally normal, has their level of comfort with their surrounding space, their street. I draw the curtains, or I don't. People do that a lot more along these little residential cul-de-sacs. So we're showing these personal values, we socialize, we mark their territory. That then translates into elements. For instance, we measured in these front yards flags, national flags or sports flags, personal signs. Flower pots are a big part. Planting in your front yard. Overall landscaping. The average front yard is a lawn. Sometimes people go beyond that, right? They plant whatever plants that they have. But then also they leave stuff around the front yard sometimes, like kids' toys and games. We measured those. Easy to do. Seats in the hybrid zone, so in front of your house. Now, porches are a tricky one because that's not necessarily a choice of a resident. It was there or it wasn't, right? But the seats really were. And then fences or hedges, right? So do people fence off their yard? And a trickier one was welcoming or unwelcoming signs. So sometimes you have a doormat saying welcome, or you have someone saying stay out, or there's camera surveillance, or I'm watching you, or whatever it is. So we measured those things. We then correlated those measurements in all those front yards with that sense of place. So I had an earlier data set which asked people essentially, are you attached to your neighborhood or your street or your house? Do you feel that your neighborhood suits your needs, and your street and your house is always these three scales? Do you feel like it has a strong identity, and do you feel like you can connect to nature? And lo and behold, of course, I was very happy, and the students were happy as well. Yes, those things correlate quite well. Specifically, the taller your fences, the higher your hedges, or your sense of place, you probably are not super connected to your neighborhood. Oddly enough, the unwelcoming signs, and this is just research, they didn't really work very well. That was not a statistically significant correlation. Toys and games, though, very positive. Turns out, and it makes a lot of sense, right? Like you leave your toys in the front yard, it does a bunch of things. It probably shows kids are playing outside, probably means you're more connected. It also shows that you trust the street because no one's going to steal your little tricycle or your toys. That's a pretty positive sign, and that correlated really well. But that led us to the strongest possible result, which is elements that allowed for socialization. So seats were incredibly well connected to residents' sense of place in every dimension, every scale, from their homes to their streets to their neighborhood. What we essentially found is that people want to be near other people, which actually kind of makes sense. You may be familiar with the Danish architect Jan Gehl in Copenhagen. He had done studies with teams at various decades of the 20th century that found similar results. If I remember correctly, there was a study in Canada done, but then also a fairly recent study, unfortunately in Dutch, in Rotterdam in the Netherlands, pretty much showed the same thing. When people put stuff in front of their own homes, partially because they feel that they control their surroundings, so they can kind of customize their surroundings, very, very important part of domestic life, but also because they can socialize, it really, really boosts their sense of place. Essentially what I'm getting to is you're seeing an upward spiral, right? So if you allow people to socialize in the zone in front of their homes, you build the social glue in neighborhoods, happier residents that feel like they have more control over their surroundings. Every upside has a downside. So how do you balance this with, for instance, a coherent streetscape? We don't want chairs all over the sidewalk blocking the sidewalk. And perhaps some people have really terrible taste. You could put up offensive signs as well, right? Or lo and behold, I could put up a Dutch flag in America. Perhaps people wouldn't like that too much. So that is a different question, right? We really measured sort of at the surface level, are these elements there? We didn't measure if they were nice looking or bad looking. That's a whole different branch of science. But that is indeed what we found. Like so much of the city life place along the places you almost would least expect it, right? On your walk home, essentially, alongside the front yards of others.
That's really good. So Marco is Marco de Bromstad, who is a Dutch social scientist who does a lot in active transport. Actually, his episode goes live today at the time of recording. So this one will go out next week. So it's
Great.
quite nicely paired together. One of the things about streets today, which is so different from 100 years ago, is the sense of lack of activity, lack of people on the street, because people are moving now in a 3-ton box. You know, they go from their home, which is a box, into their car, which is a box, into their shops, which is a box, into their work, which is a box, into their school, which is a box. I suspect that this boxed life is at some level a real cause of the loneliness. Now, obviously loneliness is a complex issue, but I can't help but feel that what you're describing is touching into this idea of, do I feel that the people around me are people that I can connect to? Now, some people you don't want to connect with a lot, and in my front garden we have a lot of flowers and we do lots of garden. We have lots of chairs. It's open. The previous owner, he ripped out all the trees at the front.
Okay.
And because he wanted to park his, what we call a tradie truck, which is a ute, a utility vehicle, you know, a big tradesman car. And so now we're left with this blank slate. It was just lawn. It was nothing else. And one of the things I did is in the driveway, there's a strip of grass in the middle of that. And there are all these flowers and flower seeds I've planted to make it brighter and more colourful. I've put in a row of compost crops, so green manure is another name, right at the edge, basically because people were parking on our curb and I didn't want them to park on my curb. I just put this very, very thin line so it wouldn't interfere with council regulations, but it did stop people parking on my lawn, which I was really happy to, because the car does dominate so much of the space, and the speed of the streets also interferes. So I was struck by what you were saying is essentially loneliness is disconnected places, lots of high fences, lots of trees. Like, trees are beautiful. I love trees. But when it's a wall, it's like talking to my back, you know, you can't make access to it. Somebody wrote a book called Cognitive Architecture. It's about how do you design your house and your garden so that it looks more like a face. And when you have a driveway, which is the prominent feature, or you have trees, you're actually blocking that capacity for a face-like appearance. So did you find the role of looking like a face as part of that welcoming connection?
I didn't, but it's very interesting that you mentioned cognitive architecture. The first time that this research was presented was actually by the authors of cognitive architecture at Tufts University in Boston. A couple of things that you mentioned that I just wanted to touch on. So to start with loneliness, right? So I looked this up before talking to you as well, as Australia seems to be having a similar issue to the US and a similar issue to Europe is a loneliness epidemic. According to some numbers, 1 in 3 Australians feel lonely at times. And don't we all, right? The glue that holds these neighborhoods together is what some people call weak ties. So weak ties is an exchange of views, a smile at times, perhaps at some point you know their names or a hello, and those are called weak ties. The ability of people to make connections to other people in their neighborhood environment is very good for combating, to an extent, it's a very complex issue, of course, loneliness. It is also just good for the social life and the social resilience of neighborhoods. So these weak ties are absolutely these kind of things that happen in the front yards of buildings as well. That's where those weak ties are made. And again, weak ties sounds bad. Let's call them sort of passing connections to people that you have, which are great to have actually, right? Imagine we get the view, the smile, the name, the hello. At some point, perhaps you might need some sugar or you lost your keys. Very, very important for the social life of neighborhoods. The study of front yards that I did is actually an outflow of a much larger research agenda that I have on the relation between buildings and public space. There's a book I recently wrote called Street Level Architecture, and it literally is on a lot of the things that you touched upon. Why do we like walking past buildings that interact with us? Partially, yes, the face-like features, but what Justin Hollander and Ann Sussman of cognitive architecture talk about is we as humans are naturally attracted to the edges of spaces. You know, when you go to a restaurant, for instance, you don't sit in the middle of the restaurant, you sit at the edges. It's a prospect and refuge psychological response, which is I sit at the edge, behind me is an old mantle with some pictures on it, and I have a view other than a view of the rest of the room in front of me. That's a completely natural thing to do. The same, by the way, these front yards, right? So you want to have a prospect of the street, you want to have a refuge, your domestic, your own space. So this is a psychological response. We have that response and we want, let's call it a cognitive load as we walk through cities. So much of walkability research is about the street. Is the sidewalk wide enough? Is the traffic taken care of? Is there, for instance, some protection between the roadway and the sidewalk? Are there good connections? The thing that was missing is, okay, well, what are we walking to and where are we walking from? What are we walking past? Not on the left side, that's the cars, but on the right side, that's the house or the storefront. As you mentioned, very rightfully so, the hedge that you can't look through, the blank wall, the facade where all the curtains are drawn so I can't look in, which is partially at the sort of superficial level as a cognitive load. I cannot learn anything new. But at the deeper level, it also might signal some distrust. And I don't like that. Perhaps I don't like to walk through an area that radiates that they don't want me around. So street level architecture looks into this and has studied 4 cities: The Hague in my native Netherlands, Detroit, Michigan, Vancouver, Canada, and then Birmingham in England. Over 100 years period of time. 100 years ago, we had different conversations about city life, street life, very different relationships between buildings and public space, right? Buildings were much more intricately connected to public space, so far more walkable cities. And how did that change? So that's what I studied in those 4 cities. Of course, finding this pattern of seeing how buildings got larger, streets got more for traffic, and we're losing that connection. And then trying to think, okay, how do you rebuild that connection? Like, we want cities that connect to its people, that facilitate contact between its people, and buildings and architecture is part of that. So how do we build an architecture of public life? So this is actually part of my, let's say, grand agenda to investigate this architecture of public life. I teach in an architecture program. Architects will always say, oh, well, that's up to us, the architects. And what I'm increasingly finding is, no, architecture has a facilitating role in public life. Because guess what? Public life is done by the public in their front yards, for example. Those are the places where you can facilitate content. What I will say is that work with a lot of real estate developers. I feed this back to architects and to developers saying, hey, make sure that you have a hybrid zone in front of your building that people can personalize and that they can put some seats in. And hey, cities, you may want to, in your zoning or in your design guidelines or codes, put that in there as well. Because if you don't, it's most likely not going to end up in the final designs of your buildings because it takes space. And that's not great. It takes money, which is even worse, right? So you have to actively kind of push for that stuff. Because again, if you don't, that's the study I've done in these 4 cities, goes away. It goes away really easy. This erosion of contact between buildings and public space, it's gone in an instant. And it's very difficult to get that back as well. Once your whole town is a parking lot, good luck trying to turn it back into a city for people. So I very much agree with your box-like argument.
My neighbours across the street from me, that's one of the few houses around which has a porch. They had a table and a couple of chairs. Was sort of perfectly matched with the aesthetic of the house. But there was nothing else on that porch. On one side, you've got these chairs and tables, which leads out into the corner of the street. It goes to the front door and closer to where the garage is. So the previous people moved out. The new people moved in. The furniture doesn't match out the front. So they've got a rocking chair and then I've got another chair and a couple of boxes. I feel like the house is approachable, that people live there now. Whereas before, in this perfect kind of almost not quite designer mid-century look, it actually felt a bit removed and isolated. And I think in this desire to be fashionable or to make sure that we look right, we can sometimes take out that humanity experience.
I could certainly see that. I always have to watch out as an architect, right? Because I might have been that person. I just installed a porch swing earlier in the spring and I'm so proud of it. Make sure to match the aesthetic. The house when I purchased mine was an 1869 house. Really did a lot of extensive renovations on the porch. The porch was really in rough shape. So some people may consider that to be off-putting, right? They say, wow, now the porch looks perfect. The aesthetics has changed. It's difficult. I see what you mean because people want to reflect their own values and perhaps the prior owners, the value of loving high design. That is their own value and it is their right to reflect that. Whenever I'm on the porch, it's almost like I have to take time to myself to drink that cup of coffee or maybe at night the gin and tonic because people will always stop by and have a chat. Social contact in my street is not a problem at all.
That's really lucky because here we're on the outskirts, so it's a very car dependent area. If you're in a more urban area, you have that more walkability. We don't have a lot of people walking by, although I'd have to say since we've made our garden more lively and interesting, we have a lot of people walk more often past our house because it's a more visually appealing place because it changes all the time because the flowers and everything. A lot of people are renting a house. It's not long term. They might only be there for maybe a year or 2. They may not have the emotional investment in the neighborhood because they're just moving around a lot because rentals are going up and up and up and up. It's nothing for it to go up more than $100 a week here at the moment. It's insane. There's that. And also with people who do own, what are some ideas that you could suggest that people could do that is low-hanging fruit? You don't have a lot of money. You don't have a lot of emotional investment. You might have a yard or a garage or something, carport. What would you suggest that people can do just to increase the chance of people coming by and opening up? And what do you do if the place that you live in has this 8-foot fence right around it and you have no social connection to the outside world?
The 8-foot fence is difficult, I will say that. But I am incredibly amazed by the ability of people to eke out space for socialization, or at the very least for showing their personal values. I'll give you a couple of examples where people don't have the space. The house is right next to the sidewalk. And sidewalks are relatively narrow as well. People will have, for instance, flowers that creep up the wall of their house. Those can be easy purchases. For instance, a flower pot, a simple plastic pot with a flower in it. that kind of hopefully forces you to water that flower every once in a while, which means you have to leave the house, water the flower, and come back in, already brings and builds this routine of you leaving the house. I promise you, you will be amazed at the positive comments that people will give to you saying, I walk past your house every day. I really like that flower. When I started working on that porch, even the most basic things I did, people said, do you know that I walk past your house every single day? And I really appreciate what you're doing. A plastic lawn chair, I assume, saying for aesthetical purposes, the most beautiful thing you can do. It's not that expensive. You mentioned renters as well. The city of Rotterdam in the Netherlands is a city with a significant amount of renter population, including renters in what the Dutch call social housing. So that is affordable housing or public housing or whatever you would call that. They did not find that people in rented housing were less inclined to put stuff in front of their house. People are inclined to socialize no matter who they are, what level of income they have. Guess who helped fund that study? The housing corporations. They were actually delighted to figure out, because they also want residents to have a sense of ownership, which also means a sense of responsibility for their environment. They're actually really delighted if people take care of their direct surroundings. That sort of niche between renting and ownership, you could probably make the argument, yes, an owner that's going to be there has been there for decades. Their house is completely customized to their needs. But do not underestimate the willingness of renters to do the same. Even in Buffalo, nearby housing, our rents are going up as well. We have an annual garden walk. This was also, by the way, an inspiration to this study where people show off their gardens. There's a renter who lives in a very, very dense building and this tiny little backyard and an alleyway, no space. He still is growing tomatoes, various types of plants that will catch every ray of sun that possibly can, and he deeply cares. And every year he opens up his garden for garden walk. Now, all these people expecting this grand front yard, there's a little sign that says, no, you have to walk through the alleyway in the back. And people are always amazed. People are always surprised to see what you can do in the little space that you have. So simple socialization can go as easy as a little plastic chair in front of your house. I personally do not see significant correlation between wealthier people having more chairs in front of their houses versus less wealthy people. Perhaps it's even the inverse, but I haven't done the study. People like to sit in front of their house, whoever they are. The same with a flower pot. It doesn't cost that much money. It really comes down to you as a person open to share your values. Do you feel like no one's going to critique you for that? And cities and designers, architects and developers, are you going to allow people to do so? I mean, if you're going to make people's lives difficult, you shouldn't have a chair in your front yard. And then that little seedling of these weak ties, right? This social glue, poof, it goes away. So I put a lot of the burden, to be honest, on the people in power, because I have very high faith in residents of homes that they do want to show themselves and they do want to socialize with others. It tends to be nipped in the bud from above, from below.
We don't live in a very wealthy suburb by any stretch, but we are now in the more middle class, more established area in our town. When we first arrived here, we lived in a poorer area. What was so interesting is that my neighbour, they didn't have a car. What they did is they had the carport area. They put a sofa there. She was on social security benefits. She had health issues, so she didn't work. And she used to just hang out there, and people would come by and relatives would come by and the carer would come by and the support workers, kids, and actually it was a very dynamic space. And I thought it would be great if we could follow the cues of people who are on social security payments to be able to see what actually works to make life vibrant, because they don't have the car, they can't afford to have that. But I also have noticed, since being here in a poorer community, there seems to be a difference in the family dynamics and the relationship dynamics and who you can rely on in poorer communities, because you need to rely on a lot of people. And my background is actually quite aspirational. The higher up you go, your relationships become more transactional. So that's just a general observation I've noticed.
Funny that you mentioned this. So one of the inspirations for my studies, one of my professors when I was a student was really into movies. And he said, we're going to watch movies on cities. I'm not here to give you any movie suggestions, except for one, which really, really brings home this point. Do the Right Thing. It's a Spike Lee movie, late 1980s. Spike Lee's an African-American movie director, so it talks about African-American life. It's filmed on site in in Brooklyn. And it talks about the life of, at the time, a low-income neighborhood. It's the larger narrative arc is not so much about street life, it's about racial tensions. My professor at the time, Roy Strickland, he said, you're going to map out who are all the players on the screen and where are they? Guess what? They're all in that zone between the home and the street. On stoops, they're hanging out the window, yelling at people or talking to people or having a meeting. For all the life happens is life happens at the edge, not in the center. The center is for the boxes. Remember, the center is where the cars go through. It was a really wonderful eye-opener to see how much public life takes place, and it has nothing to do with money. These are people that were using any types of space, a windowsill, a stoop, like those Brooklyn brownstone stoops. They're free seats, and that really depicts working class life in Brooklyn in the 1980s, very much from the perspective that you're talking about. It's an interesting observation that you say. As we rise up the ranks, perhaps we get more transactional. We don't have time to go sit on the porch, right? I don't sit on the porch all day. I have to sit inside and work.
I've really enjoyed the conversation. So final words, what would you like to share?
I guess what I would like to share is my dimension of my studies on street life. So it is very important to have these walkable cities where people come together. It is more crucial to understand why cities are there in the first place, which is social connections. And a lot of social connections don't just happen on the street, they actually happen on the buildings that line the street. And it's not just about shops. It's not just about coffee shops. That's too black and white. That's too simplistic. Is a lot of the social life that happens in our cities happens in these zones that you walk past in your everyday life. That's why it's called everyday urbanism. Those weak ties, right, of those connections. And as I discovered, so many of those connections happen right in front of our homes. So get out, plant that little seed. And it's not just a little seed in a flower pot. It's the seed of the connection, of the blossoming. It does not cost that much money. Time, and you will be rewarded that amount of time spent just outside your house. Don't just walk to the car in the carport and leave. The extra 5 minutes of your day, trust me, it'll be worth it. If everyone on your street does that, your street will be so much more vibrant and so much more interesting.
Absolutely, I totally agree. And certainly that's been my experience. As I said, I've made connections, but also friends. We only moved here a bit over 2 years ago, and I feel such a part of the community, partly because I started this community group, but also because I actually hand weed the front yard. And just hanging out in that space means that people see that I'm tending to my home and I'm available to chat. People respond really warmly to that.
That sounds really good.
All right. Thank you so much, Conrad. I really appreciate the time for you coming on the show.
Thanks for having me over. And I look forward to seeing more of your guests and see what they talk about as well.
All right. Thanks so much, Conrad. Thanks for enjoying Streets and People presented by Get Around Cabo Car Free. We publish our podcast regularly at the usual places and on our website where you can find out more about us. getaroundcabocarfree.com.au. That's www.getaround, get around, that's pretty straightforward. Cabo, C-A-B-O, that's short for Caboolture. Car Free, C-A-R-F-R-E-E. There's no hyphen in that. .com.au. Our theme music is The Thief on AM Sound, which is just like our cars on our streets, always stealing the space. So let's stop that thief.